Okay.
Mhm. Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're just going to wait a few more minutes, see if we can get more people in the room.
Hello, can you hear us?
Yep.
Okay, and could you just say a few words? This is Brenda from White Sands. Want to make sure.
Hello.
Okay.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. We're going to get started. All right. We've got everyone in the waiting room. So hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our virtual talk. We ask that you just keep yourself muted throughout the presentation. If you have any questions, please type them into the chat at the bottom of your screen. Our speaker will be happy to address any of your questions or comments at the end of the program. If you're joining us from Facebook Live, we want to say welcome to you as well. Our Facebook Live audience can ask questions using the comment section on Facebook. We'll be monitoring those comments and answering those questions at the end of the program as well. Please note that this talk is being recorded and streamed live and will be posted to our social media channels once the talk is over. If you would like to rewatch this talk or watch previous virtual tours and talks, please check out our YouTube or our Facebook pages. I'm really excited to introduce you to our speaker, Karen, today. Her talk is entitled 18th Century Rococo Painting in France. Thank you so much, Karen. I'm very excited to hear your presentation.
Thank you, Kyla. Kyla is our new intern, and she's an undergraduate at Sarah Lawrence studying art history, and we love having her. So welcome. So we're going to begin, and I will show you a painting that sort of is iconic when you think about the Rococo. Now, I have titled it the Rococo in France. That is not to say that the Rococo did not exist in other countries. Germany had a really strong Rococo presence eventually, parts of Bavaria, of course, Russia, Vienna, so England eventually, but the focus really, the origins of the Rococo really begins in France. So I want to paint for you a little bit of a picture, no pun intended, about what is going on in France and how the Rococo emerges. Now, the word Rococo comes from the word rocaille, and that is spelled Rocaille. Rocaille actually refers to rock. And why? Why is that? Because during the 18th century, early part of the 18th century, we began to see this rocaille, these rock formations in grottos and gardens in the palaces of the aristocrats in France. It also relates to some of the embellishments you would find in the interiors of Rococo mansions. Now, when does the Rococo actually originate? Loosely about 1715. Who were the first proponents of the Rococo? Well, they were Boucher and Watteau, particularly Watteau and then Boucher. So we have two painters who cornered the genesis of the Rococo, and we have the time period around 1715. Sorry. Why 1715? Well, that is the death of Louis XIV or Louis XIV, the Sun King. And of course, aristocrat of parties and gaiety and mass consumption, entertainment, and so on and so forth. When he passed away, there was a time when the aristocrats wanted to move out of Versailles, where he had been ensconced at Versailles, and they began to move into these smaller palaces in and around Paris. And in that reason, they needed a different kind of architectural element. And I'm going to be talking about this beautiful painting of Marie Antoinette, but I do want to show you what the interiors look like in a Rococo mansion. Now, let's look at some of the characteristics. We think about more gaiety, more pastels, curvilinear designs, these C curves in the, architectural elements and interiors of these buildings. We see lighter types of furniture, not so Baroque, because Versailles and the preceding styles were Baroque, very much heavier, darker. This is light, pastel or candy box colors. You can see a lot of gilding here. You can see more mythological subject matter as opposed to more historical paintings. They still did portraits. They did still do some historical paintings, but there is a new concentration on more whimsical, erotic, mythological themes. And we're going to specifically talk about that as I talk about some of the artists. But look at all these, the cupids, the mythological elements here, the chandeliers, the lighter furniture. So this is the Hotel Soubise, and it was built in the 14th century, but the interiors were redone, and it was a student of Mansart. If you think about the Mansart Russe in France, the pupil of Mansart was named Germain Buffon. And Buffon was one who really began to embellish these interiors with a Rococo style. So I'm going to begin by showing you and talking a little bit about the historical context as we look at the paintings. Now, Hyacinthe Rigaud was, along with Largillier, one of the top artists painting portraits of the rich and famous, so to speak, in the early part of the 18th century. So we're not quite in the Rococo. Why is that? Because as I mentioned, it dates to the passing of Louis XIV. So Louis XIV here, in around 63 years old, is painted by Rigaud. And Rigaud, as I said, was the portrait painter, along with Largillier, of the up and coming and the wealthy. Rigaud is a little different, though. He painted almost always the aristocracy, whereas Nicolas Largillier, we actually have two beautiful paintings in the Timken, Madame Serre and Monsieur Pupol. I hope you see it when you visit the Timken. And they're more Baroque, but they're not the royal family. They are working upper bourgeois. So Rigaud would be considered, he painted a lot of the royal family. In fact, this painting of Louis XIV was meant for the King of Spain. Why the King of Spain? Well, he married Marie Therese, who was of Spanish royalty. This painting never, however, did go to Spain, it stayed in France. So let's talk a little bit about this painting. He is in his coronation robes. He's about 63, as I mentioned, and he's in a coronation robe with the noted fleur de lis, you know, the symbol of the royal family. And he has this sword of Charlemagne. And the sword of Charlemagne was used in coronation ceremonies and important events in the among the French royalty. And so it's a very important embellished sword. Now we have something kind of odd. We have his scepter, which is turned upside down. And we have a crown. So this is his throne, and this is his crown, and this is his scepter used as a walking stick. Now, a little bit humorous in this painting is the showing of his lean legs. Now, why is that? Well, he was a dancer. He loved to dance and party, and he was a very frivolous king, and he believed in divine monarchy. So he really thought of himself as a divine monarch. And this is an important point because I'm going to show you the counterpoint to the Rococo in just a moment. Lastly, this painting was so important, and because he believed in the divine aspects of the monarchy, he thought of himself as the Sun King, remember? This painting would be used to represent him when he was not in presence. So, for example, if he were in another part of the palace at Versailles, this might represent him, and you could not even turn your back. This painting was so important. Now, look at this. This is very Baroque, though, when you think about the rich colors of the drapes. But we begin to see some of the lighter colors coming in, and of course, this more frivolous subject matter. Not frivolous in terms of being the king, but an aristocrat, as opposed to maybe something a little different. Now, one thing we have to talk about at this time is the Enlightenment, because while we have the French courts, we're going to talk about Louis XIV, Louis XV, and Louis XVI, we also have the Age of Enlightenment, and it begins about 1685. And the Age of Enlightenment, Sir Isaac Newton, John Locke, Voltaire, Diderot, eventually, who was an art historian, critic, these men are against this, the aristocracy and the primacy of kings. They believe in democracy and a republic that is voted on, and they have all manner of giving people individual rights. So as we have the kings on one side, we also have the Enlightenment that is evolving beginning about 20 years before. So we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go on. Now, Claude Gillot. So I mentioned that Antoine Watteau, who did not live a very long life, we'll look at some of his paintings. He died at about 36, 37. But we do have his predecessor. And I do like to show you how artists kind of evolve. And as I said, because Watteau was so important to the development of the Rococo in France, we have to look at why, what made him interested in kind of moving away from the Baroque and into a new genre. And his genre, I will show you in just a minute, is called Fête Galante. But this is not Fête Galante. What is this? Okay, Claude Gillot was a famous draftsman. He also was a set designer for the opera and the theater and costume designer. He also did, as I say, some sort of drawings and etchings, but he was known for his work in the theater. And he worked a lot with the Commedia dell'arte. And the Commedia dell'arte originates in Italy, and it did come into France. And it's comedy, it's satire, clowns, and theater. And it became very important. However, the Commedia dell'arte sometimes insulted people, and eventually the aristocracy kicked the Commedia dell'arte back into Italy because they said they sometimes insulted the upper classes. So it didn't always have a favorable position in France. But let's talk about this. All right, les deux carousses, the two carousers, and what it is two members of the Commedia dell'arte, Scaramouche, and I'm not sure the other one, and they're kind of dressed in female costumes, actually, and they've come to an impasse on a road, and they can't decide who should proceed. It's so silly. It's so ironic. And what do? They call a judge. Here he is in his robes, and he's trying to dictate, okay, this is how it's going to be. And they're like, you know something, I don't even want to listen to you. We don't even want to listen to you. So it's very comedic, and but it's more Baroque. If you look at the date, it still carries some of the weight of the Baroque in terms of the architectural elements, the darker colors, but it starts to lean into this beginning of Rococo. Now, we'll move on. And now we're going to talk about Antoine Watteau, the father of the Baroque, the Rococo in France. So let's talk a little bit about him. He was born on the border of Flanders. And so he was very aware of a lot of the Dutch and Flemish painters of the Baroque. And he also began his career sort of painting Renaissance copies of Veronese and others, because he was just trying to learn about art. And he did settle in Paris, and he became enamored with the theater and Gillot. And he also became so interested in this idea of the fête galante. What is fête galante? Well, it means an outdoor outing with these well-born individuals, young and beautiful and erotic and very feminine and light, diffuse colors. And even the style of brushstroke is it's slightly more gestural, it's lighter, it's gayer, there's gaiety in it. And he celebrates youth and beauty and female ideals. Now, the island of Cythera is probably one of his most iconic paintings. And what is Cythera? Well, Cythera was said to be the birthplace of Aphrodite. And so, of course, and there is a representation here, and I hope you can see it to the right, of a sculptural element festooned with flowers. And so these people they're disembarking. They come from this side to the left, and they're climbing this little hill, and they will have some type of party. And so this fête galante is outdoor activity, it's light, it's beautiful, it's beginning of the Rococo. And of course, also this use of mythological ideas and ideals. And if I can say one other thing about Watteau, sadly, he died very young. And so his career as an artist was truncated, but it was said that he was just magnificent, his use of color and his draftsmanship, his ideas. Who could say how his career would have evolved if he had lived a longer life? Now, so let's talk, this is just the beginning of the Rococo, and I want to talk about what's happening with the French kings. So I mentioned that Louis XIV, the Sun King, dies, and in 1715. And what happens to the court? Well, it becomes a period of the Regency. And why is it a period of the Regency? Because the great-grandson who takes over is Louis XV. And he's not the direct descendant, he's the great-grandson. But he's only 5. He's a Dauphin king. So what happens is the regents have to take over and the ruling of France until he's a little bit older. I believe he was about 17 when he began to really take over. So now we're in the period of the Rococo, and the king is Louis XV. He was considered a little bit of a nicer person than 14th. He wasn't quite as demanding of the king and the aristocracy. However, he loved entertainment and dancing and all that. And he was also seeing some of his friends moving out of Versailles and moving into Paris. But still, he was a royal head, and he had a very important mistress, Madame Pompadour. And we're going to talk about her when we look at a few more paintings. But let's go back to Gilles. Gilles is like Perrault, the clown, and he's the sad clown. And he comes from Commedia dell'arte, because I mentioned that theater, and Commedia dell'arte is very important to Watteau, Gillot, and some others. And you can see these classic theater actors. We have the doctor who rode the donkey and some of these other clowns, and they're looking at Gilles with a little bit of disdain. And he stands forward, almost like the setting is just a backdrop, and he's almost standing on a ledge. And look at him, he's kind of a sad sack. he's got these rolled up sleeves and they're too big and his pants are a little foreshortened and he looks really sad. And it was said that his only friend was the moon. But it shows this very light brushstroke that Watteau employs. It shows this member of the Commedia dell'arte, and we're moving into kind of different subject matter. But we are now under the rule of Louis XV in France. And we'll move on. All right. It's very important to note that in this talk that I will give, and what is happening in France is not just the Rococo. Primarily from 1715 to about 1735, 1740, a lot of Rococo style in painting. However, we have other artists who somewhat diverge from the Rococo, and eventually at the end of this talk, I will introduce some elements of neoclassicism, which emerges at the end of the 18th century. Now, who was Chardin? Chardin is considered one of the greatest painters of the 18th century in France, but stylistically, you really can't say that. I'm going to go back for just a moment. Stylistically, this was done about 20 years hence or 15, something like that. Look how different. This is a much more, it looks more Dutch because he was very influenced by the Dutch and Flemish still life painters. Chardin did not travel as many artists did at this time. He stayed almost exclusively in Paris, where his career developed. And he was known to be not only a genre painter, which I'll show you in just a minute, which means showing people in their interiors, but he loved to do still lifes, and he was a gifted still life painter. He saw his still life elements as the protagonist in the drama of a painting. So instead of painting an aristocrat or an important person, he infuses the elements of the still life with like a personality. And of course, you see that with this animated cat, and he looks very interested in this fillet of fish. And then we have, of course, these fish hanging. But the darker colors, the use of light, it is a bit more reminiscent of some of the Dutch Baroque painters. If you look at our own Peter Claus in the Timken, which was done about 90 years before this, you will see the darker, a little bit infused with light. So we definitely see that inspiration for Chardin's work. He was collected by many royal patrons, although he preferred the middle class. And he did look at the work of two great Baroque painters of France, Poussin and Claude Lorrain. So he was very much influenced by them, a much more classical take. All right, we're going to move on, if I can get my cursor to look at what this would be considered a genre painting. Even though it is of a young man, you might think, well, it's a portrait. Not exactly. It is symbolic and it's allegorical. Now, I do want to point out something I think is pretty interesting. I do a lot of talks on Dutch and Flemish painting. We have such a masterful collection at the Timken of Dutch and Flemish Renaissance and Baroque painting. And what I talk about a lot is how these paintings are so infused with allegorical references. We think about some of the memento mori or the vanitas elements of the 17th century Dutch paintings, for example, a skull, the ephemeral nature of life, a stopwatch, a little watch that shows time is passing, an overturned glass that might signal temperance. And I'm bringing that up because there is a memento mori in this painting by Chardin. And it does come from his interest in Dutch painting. And what it is, and this subject has been done many times in Dutch painting, is the soap bubble. So what does it refer to? The soap bubble refers to ephemeral nature of life, transient nature of life. A soap bubble just flits in the air, it just kind of disappears. So that's really the underlying meaning of this painting. And look at the young boy. He's blowing this bubble to the entertainment of a young man here. And he sets up the painting in a triangular setup. And that's quite remarkable because it has our eye circling around the entire painting, and he leans so carefully. He's such an amazing illustrator. He leans really carefully on the ledge, and we see a little bit of nature here. And that's one thing these Rococo artists, even though Chardin kind of transcends classicism and the Rococo, nature was really important to them. And as I mentioned with Watteau, they painted nature outside. So they did make lots of really strong observations with nature, but it doesn't have the palette of the typical Rococo. And I mentioned the colors would be a little bit more candy box, so the pastels, more yellows and pinks and blues. This is a much more muted, much more Baroque or classical palette. So we're going to move on now. Claude Vernet was, we have this remarkable painting in our Timken collection, but Vernet was a painter of history. So I wanted to mention that history paintings are still very popular at this time in the 18th century, even though we have a lot more images of the aristocracy, we still have history paintings. Now, Vernet was considered one of the great landscape painters of France of the 18th century. He loved history. He actually lived in Italy for almost 20 years. Many of these artists, and I may forget to tell you which ones, many of them received like the Prix de Rome. And so therefore they had opportunities to study in Italy. And what's happening in Italy at this time, beginning at the very later part of the 17th century and going into the 18th century, was the excavations at Pompeii and Herculaneum. So the beautiful ruins, these important ruins that were being excavated, began to become interesting to people. And so many of these artists wanted to incorporate some elements of history in their painting. And also the art critic, archaeologist Winkelmann, who was talking about the difference between Roman and Greek art, was really beginning to be popular. So therefore, we start to see Roman and Greco-Roman ruins in some of these paintings. So this port at sunset in the Timken collection, if you look at some of these buildings, you say, wait a minute, this is a port, but this lighthouse is from Naples, and it is in Naples, Italy. But we also have this column, and I believe this is Trajan's column. If I'm not mistaken, I believe it's Trajan's column. I could be, let's say Trajan's column. And we also have a ship with a Dutch sail. So we have a Dutch ship, and it's a Latin sailboat. And those Latin sailboats were found more in the Middle East. So we have a sort of a compilation of different elements in this painting. Now, Vernet was known for painting ports of Europe, and he did something like 15 famous ports in Europe, and many of them, these paintings are in the Louvre today. But this happens to be in our Timken collection. So it's a history painting. It's also a composite painting, meaning we don't really have everything in its proper place. It's a composite image. Now, I'm only doing one painting of Vernet because we have so many artists to talk about, but I wanted to show you Maurice de la Tour. Now, he's not related to the famous French painter Georges de la Tour, who is Baroque. I don't think he was part of the family, but we're looking at a very interesting portrait by a wonderful pastel artist. He developed the medium of pastel to such an extent that he really invents some great ways to handle the medium. It's a little bit fragile, a little bit ephemeral. He used types of taping and different types of paper. So he experimented quite a bit to make pastel quite a wonderful medium. Now, he is painting at the time of the reign of Louis XV. And Louis XV had two women in his life that are very important. And I mentioned her earlier, Madame de Pompadour, and then eventually Madame du Barry. These two girlfriends were very instrumental in developing and supporting some of these Rococo artists. They were very instrumental in helping to develop Gobelins and porcelain, factories. Madame Pompadour helped kind of develop that more. Gobelins had not only tapestries, but furnishings in some of these Rococo mansions. And so Pompadour especially, was really important to sponsoring some of these artists. This one, Portrait with Les Jabot, is a quite remarkable painting. Now, he was among the most celebrated pastel artists. His success came from his commissions, and I said from the aristocracy. And he did a painting of Madame Boucher, one of the originators, Monsieur Boucher, one of the originators of the Rococo, but he also did a painting of Voltaire, who is connected to the Enlightenment. And so he became really noted for his skillful portraits. This is a portrait of himself, and he wears a lace collar. And we need to really look at this kind of psychologically, because at first glance, you look at this portrait and you say, oh, it's happy and he's kind of carefree, and he's opening himself up to being viewed by the spectators. But in reality, if you look a little closely, there is a bit of a supercilious sense about him. And he was not that kind of person, but he really began to have mental issues. So toward the end of his life, he actually, we don't know if he spiraled into dementia or madness, but he did suffer in his older part of his life in some really difficult mental illness. However, he was very beloved because he was one of the greatest philanthropists of the 18th century. He developed schools for women. He had some of his art, because he was very popular, paid for helping impoverished artists. He set up agencies for social change. So he was a really, really remarkable artist and beloved by the aristocracy. It's just too bad that his mental state kind of diminished. And so we're going to go on to one of his other famous portraits. And she sponsored him to quite an extent, Madame de Pompadour. And I said she was the girlfriend of Louis XV. And the thing about her was she loved to sponsor cultural events. And so she's very noted for that. She sits here. She was not from the aristocracy. In fact, the aristocracy often sort of poo-pooed her, like, really, she's not even an aristocrat. She's from the middle classes. But they said, no, she's a very cultivated woman. In fact, Louis XV very much listened to her about a lot of policy. And Louis XV, as I said, he was more beloved than his predecessor, his great-grandfather. But I will say something, that his career was very troubled by his treatment of Protestants. He was very disdainful of the Protestant Huguenots in France at that time. So that's one of his deficits as a king. But he was considered a little kinder in many ways. I know that sounds oxymoronic if I just said he was not good to the Protestants, but in other ways, he was less in this primacy of the kings. He didn't see himself as a god as his predecessor did. So let's talk a little bit about this beautiful portrait of Pastel in the Louvre, Madame de Pompadour, and she holds a musical score. And why is that? Well, she actually trained as a musician and loved music. And so she was always tied to this idea of cultivating music. And you can see that she was actually a very learned person, a self-taught, I believe. And she wears this exquisite dress. You can see that she's a member of the upper classes. Now, she doesn't wear like this very elaborate wig. She's a lot more, you don't see a lot of jewelry. So she looks a little bit more like a thinking person, as opposed to just, I'm all about my position in the court. You see, she has the globe, some beautiful, this beautiful frame painting and books, and the scalloped furniture. So she was known as a cultivator and a supporter of many of these artists. And as I mentioned, Porcelain, and other things that really helped develop the interiors and the life of the French aristocrats. Now, Francois Boucher. Francois Boucher, we do have a beautiful Boucher, and we're going to be looking at that in just a moment in the Timken collection. And I do want to talk a little bit about him. So Boucher was actually like one of the fathers of the Rococo. And you can see he worked in the Rococo style. He looked at classical themes, mythology. He loved the decorative elements. He was considered the most celebrated painter of this early part of the 18th century. He did win the Prix de Rome. He didn't go immediately, but he did go eventually. And ironically enough, Madame de Pompadour was his greatest patron, and he did many portraits of her. But the great Jacques-Louis David, the neoclassical artist who we'll look at the very end, was actually for a short time Boucher's student. And you might say, how? Pastel and frivolity with neoclassical themes. But eventually, Francois Boucher said, you know, I think I'm not the artist for you. I'm older now, and I really don't want to take on a student. And so I'm going to pass you on to another artist, Vien, and we'll look at Vien's work in just a second. So Boucher, this pastel, this frivolity, the aristocratic elements, you know, the girlfriend of the queen is his great patron. So the aristocracy and the royal families loved his work. And you can see this interest in mythology. So let's tell the story of Mars and Venus caught by Vulcan. Okay, so Venus, Aphrodite in Greek, of course, we see the Roman names. She was so in love with Mars, the god of war. Sadly, however, she was married to Vulcan, the god of fire. And Vulcan was not really very nice. He was a mean person. He was lame, and so he had a lot of insecurity with that, and so he was very difficult. And Venus just couldn't really deal with him, and so she went to the arms of her beloved Mars. Well, Vulcan's not too happy. And in this painting, this very quintessentially Rococo painting, we see this golden, like a cloth that is draping and tenting the two lovers, and this beautiful erotic, because remember the Rococo, very erotic, and he tents them. So Vulcan's like, I'm not going to allow this interaction, this romantic interaction. I'm going to tent them, and I'm going to capture them, and I'm going to let all the gods look at them and make fun of them and mock them, because I'm horrified by their behavior. So here we have, I hope you can see my cursor, but in the lower right, in the middle ground of the painting, we see Vulcan wrapping them up. We see the little Pucci, like, we're not really sure what we should be doing here. And then you see this beautiful light-filled sky. It almost looks like a Tiepolo sky. So, and the dove of, you know, light and peace. So it's a very romantic and almost kind of sad, but it relates to stylistically the height of the Rococo. These types of paintings were beloved by the royal families, and I had mentioned Madame Pompadour. He was the darling of Madame Pompadour, and it's very decorative. Now, we have a beautiful Boucher in the Timken, and it's one of our, if not our largest painting, and it's Lovers in the Park. Now, this is slightly, it's done earlier, and it's a little darker in color, but still we have more of those candy box colors, the candy box colors, the pale yellows and the blues. And we also have this light-filled sky, very dull light. And it's not that sharp Baroque light that we see, but there's a lot of other elements that I'd like to point out. Here in the middle ground of the painting, we have two Putti or Cupid-like figures. And if you look closely, they mirror these two lovers. Their body formations are almost identical. Now, there's a couple things that I want to point out. This painting is very large, and I'm going to point out some flaws, and I use that term very loosely, because Boucher was an extremely talented artist. He could illustrate, his drawings were magnificent, he could paint beautifully, but this was meant to hang in a large theater or perhaps an opera house, this particular painting. So these little issues I'm going to point out just for fun. would never be seen if it were placed in a high wall in, let's say, an opera house. So let's point them out just for fun. If you look at the young man, you see these legs. Honestly, the legs do not connect well to the torso. They almost look like they're separated. Second, if this young woman were to stand, she would be 7 feet tall. So that's a bit of an issue. Thirdly, the little shepherdess, who's actually an aristocrat dressed up like a servant, she does not have a pathway. Where does she come from? Sorry. Where does she come from? There's no pathway really. So that's a little bit interesting. But of course, this was not a problem because it was meant to hang in a very high space. Now, there's a few allegorical references. And one thing about the Rococo, it wasn't quite as allegorical as I mentioned with, let's say, the Dutch Baroque, but there are a few elements here to mention. Look at the little lapdog. Now, in the aristocratic circles in the royal families, many French individuals would have lapdogs. That was kind of de rigueur. But it also is a little bit of a comical reference to fidelity. If you look at the great portrait of Arnolfini by the brilliant Jan van Eyck, there's a little lapdog in the foreground of the painting, in the marriage portrait. And in that painting, it stood for fidelity. Remember, many of you are too young. I'm not. And I remember the ideal dog's name was Fido, right? It comes from fidelity because dogs relate to fidelity. Well, what's the irony here is Fido is looking as these two lovers who are supposed to be so in love, he's looking at another woman. So it's a little bit ironic. So he glances at this young woman who's dressed as a shepherdess, but again, she's a member of the aristocracy because these individuals, just like Watteau and the fête galante, they love to, and fête de chambre, which is more interior expressions of Rococo activity. She's in a beautiful park-like setting. We have a dovecote here, and we have this beautiful park and this nature and the sculpture. So this is very quintessential Rococo, a little darker in palette, but very typical of something that Madame Pompadour would have loved. Now, Fragonard. Fragonard was a student of Boucher. And we also have a beautiful small Fragonard in the Timken, and they go side by side, Boucher, the teacher of Fragonard. And I'll show you that painting in just a second. But let's talk about this one, the Bathers. Now, Fragonard was raised in Paris, and he briefly studied with Chardin, and then he moved on to Boucher. And he won the Prix de Rome, and he went to Italy, and he studied classical antiquities and the Renaissance, but he began to receive a lot of commissions from the aristocracy. And so he said, I'm making more money doing these smaller, light, frivolous paintings. They were very frivolous. And I don't think I want to do any more big history paintings. So he made his career more for these smaller paintings that decorated some of the palaces that were outside of Versailles, because these smaller paintings would not work in a big palace. These were more for smaller homes. Okay, Bathers. Now, this is kind of a general painting. It's not of a specific women, but it's very erotic, and it shows those curvilinear serpentine style of the Rococo. It shows this interest in nature, and also an interest in this particular painting of what's called dynamism. And if you recall, dynamism really talks about how nature is infused with life, like movement and dynamic qualities. And you very much see that in this painting. It seems like everything is rolling, like there's motion and movement in this painting, and these beautiful pink, of course, Rubens was an influence to his work, this kind of Rubenesque women, although Rubens was, of course, in the Baroque, this great Flemish painter. But you see this very erotic, her drapes seem like clouds. It's so lighthearted and gay. But we have another painting that was done older as we get closer to the French Revolution. We have a blind man's buff. Now, some people mistake the word and they think, oh, I even did blind man's bluff, but actually the word is buff. And it does relate to years ago, in the medieval times, children played these games. Blind Buff was one of them. And you put a blindfold and the people go around and they try to grab other people or find you, and you probably played it as a child. And so here we are again in this aristocratic or royal scene, fête galante. They're outdoors, they're probably having a picnic, and we have all kinds of beautifully dressed youth in these candy box colors and this exquisite attention to nature, more gestural in the brush strokes, not tighter like we see in the Baroque. And here is a sculpture. Now, my supposition is that that's probably Zeus. And why? Because if you know anything about Zeus, he was quite the, let's say, he was very scandalous in his behavior, a scoundrel. Why? Because he would transform himself into different forms in order to interact with women who were mortal. He transformed himself into bull and took away Europa. He transformed himself into rain, into gold coins, and all manner of disguises. And why I bring that up is because it looks like Venus, I beg your pardon, it looks like, sorry, Zeus is overseeing this party where people will interact with each other and maybe new relationships will evolve, and it's very frivolous. Okay, I see that I'm going a little bit over time, so I want to go on. Jean-Baptiste Greuze was a history painter, and he was really supported by the art critic Denis Diderot. So Diderot was one of the first art critics, of the French Baroque, and he was interested in the work of Voltaire and some of the Enlightenment philosophers and thinkers, and he did believe in a lot of the principles of the Enlightenment. But he really did not like the aristocracy, and he did not like the frivolity of the aristocracy, and he kind of promoted Greuze. So Greuze here paints something that's quite different. I mean, stylistically, you see this and you think, it really has a sort of different sensibility. He studied at the Royal Academy in Paris. Catherine the Great of Russia, Catherine II, was very interested in his work, and Madame Pompadour also. But he unfortunately married a terrible woman, Greuze, and his latter part of his life was filled with controversy and bankruptcies. So he had a really terrible end of his life. But for a while, he was very much celebrated. But at the end, he did die penniless. So what is this painting about? The Broken Mirror. This is a very metaphorical, allegorical painting because it talks about the loss of virginity. And you might say, what? How is that? Well, the broken mirror symbolically represents the loss of virginity. A yapping dog is a little different than a seated dog. A yapping dog does deal with improper behavior, youth. And then we have the hand. And I've told you this many times, that hands are the most difficult part of the human being to paint, as most artists would say. And then, of course, second would be the faces. But her beautiful hands are without a ring. So she has given up her virginity, and she's lamenting that, and her hand is bare. And the room is in disarray. It's in disarray because her life now is in disarray. So she has given up herself. She's really upset with herself, and she's mourning the, quote, broken mirror. So we'll move on. And another kind of, Greuze was very interested in moralizing and using moralizing themes in his painting. And this is actually, there is a oil in the Louvre. This was a preparatory drawing, and it relates to the return of the prodigal son. And in this case, this prodigal son was supposed to take care of his family, and he was supporting his family, but he decides to leave and go to be in battle. He decides to be a soldier or an officer. And when he comes back, his servants and family say, wait a minute, you're way too late. Your father is dead. So it is like the prodigal son, but instead of the father being able to welcome the son and say forgiveness, is in my heart, I'll forgive you. No, it's beyond that point. But look at stylistically, because remember I said that there begins to have discoveries in Herculaneum and Pompeii, and Greek antiquities are being understood by Winckelmann. This is developed like a frieze, a series of images lined up. You would see a sculptural frieze, or you can see it in painting. So this is ink and water and graphite, and it represents a more interest in sculptural history. Now, I want to talk about, I only have a few, 10 minutes, or I want to quickly talk about Villiers Costa. And she was a magnificent artist. Several really important women artists are working at this time, and she painted for Marie Antoinette. So now we're in the third and last of the Louis, we're now Louis XVI, who was married to Marie Antoinette. And if you remember, they were guillotined. And this was the era of the development just before the French Revolution. A Dr. Guillotine saw beginning, this is a few years before that, but the French Revolution begins shortly, and the guillotine is developed because the revolutionaries were killing so many aristocrats and so forth that they had to have a humane way of dealing with that. But we won't talk about that. We'll talk about this painting. I just had to throw in that little nugget of information. So her father was a silversmith, and her mother was a painter of miniatures. So she came from a pretty well-known family and a pretty famous family, and she showed a real penchant for art as a young woman. And she was actually one of the few women voted into the academy. She married someone who was pretty supportive of her career, and she had children. But look just quickly at this exquisite still life. And you can see elements of Chardin's work in here, but look at this treen. This silver treen, if you look closely, it's kind of hard to see in a secondary way, but there's actually a little image of her studio. And then we see all this lavish attention painted to the lobster, which shows an upper class table, because this was maybe, this was maybe, a delicacy, not in the beginning, but eventually. And then this beautiful silver and gold, and then the right gorgeous fruit. So she was known as a still life painter, but I also want to point out something else. She was also a painter, a portrait painter. As I say, she did many of Marie Antoinette. Now, this painting is of her, we think is of her sister. And it says, portrait of a violinist. Music is very important in the 17th century, theater and opera. But this is probably her sister, because she painted mostly her own circle of people if she wasn't painting the royal family. This is probably not a violin, though. It is related to the violin, but it's an early instrument. And she looks again with focus on the sheets of music, and she holds her violin or instrument like the violin very touchingly. I'm seeing I'm running out of time, and I do want to go really quickly to Joseph Marie Vien. And Vien was a history painter, and he too was kind of promoted by Diderot, but his were, Jacques-Louis David studied with him for a time, and he was not considered quite as talented as his successor. Jacques-Louis David is one of the greatest painters ever. So this is a little more frivolous, it's a little bit lighter. This was one of a series of paintings crowning his mistress, sort of about Greek mythology, and just a little bit lighter. But Vien, one thing he did do is he did study what was happening in Herculaneum and Pompeii, and he began to promote a different style, less Rococo and more into what is called neoclassicism, because of his studies with the Greco-Roman ruins that he was beginning to see. And but he was a painter of the kings and queens. So, excuse me for going a little ahead. So here we go. I want to go to two more artists. I only have like 2 more minutes, so I'm going to go really quickly. Elizabeth Viech-Lebrun, and she too was around the same time as Coster, and she was the darling of Marie Antoinette. Marie Antoinette loved her work, and she painted many portraits of Marie Antoinette. And when she painted this portrait, before I forget, I want to tell you that even though the Palace of Versailles and the Louvre have marvelous Rococo collections, if you really want to see a whole slew of Rococo painting and really study it, you can go to London and look at the Wallace collection, because the Wallace collection is one of the best collections of Rococo painting, and it's actually a free museum. So if you get a chance. So let's go back to this painting. When Viche Lebrun painted this painting, she first did it with Marie Antoinette in a chemise, like a dressing gown. And it was, oh my gosh, the aristocrats and the royal family, like, oh, you can't do that. That's the queen. That's the wife of Louis XVI. And so she goes, okay, I'll do it again. And it was meant for something very special. So she takes out the chemise and she puts in this exquisite, elaborate silk or satin dress, and the queen is wearing the pearls. Remember, I told you the pearls were the bling of that time. And she has these peacock feathers or ostrich feathers, and she holds a rose from her beautiful garden. And the rose mirrors her beauty, that pale pink face. And unfortunately, she did meet her demise. She was guillotined along with her husband. They were fleeing to Austria, and they caught them. Okay, I know I'm going over time, but if you could just let me, Kyla, just go 2 more paintings really quickly. I just want to show you a self-portrait of Viche Lebrun. She did suffer a bit. She had to flee France because her patrons were fleeing, but she survived. And she had a terrible marriage, really. So she was on her own, but she did manage to come back to France eventually and actually, like Jacques-Louis David, paint for Napoleon. So this is a beautiful portrait. She was very interested in the work of Anthony van Dyck. And also she too looked at the paintings of, let's say, Franz Hals and some of the other, and Rubens, but she makes herself so exquisite. She's delicate, she's beautiful, she's very fresh looking. She doesn't have a lot of artifice around her. Some pretty earrings here, the beautiful feathers, fresh flowers are meant to be shown here. And this is her pride as an artist. So she really developed quite a following, and she really was considered extremely talented. And lastly, I'm just going to go to this painting. Jacques-Louis David, who I told you studied with Vien, moves away from the Rococo. Initially he studies with Boucher, but he's not interested. And now we're well into the French Revolution, because Jacques-Louis David took the ideas of the Enlightenment and he kind of ran with it. And I wanted to show you the death of Marat because it sums up really what was happening, the revolution. So Marat was a revolutionary, just like Robespierre and Jacques-Louis David, and they're fighting to get rid of the aristocracy. And what happened was Marat welcomes this woman, Charlotte Corday, into his bath. And the reason why he's in a bathtub, you think, a bathtub? He suffered from a terrible skin condition. And the only way he would be comfortable to do writings and things like that was in the bath. So he writes in the bathtub, and Charlotte Corday sends him a letter of welcome. Oh, I'm really interested in your work as a revolution. Of course she wasn't. She was a member of the aristocracy. So she stabs him. And here's the bloody knife. And here, Marat, who was a revolutionary, was meant to be like Jesus in a tomb. So we went from the beautiful paintings of Watteau, the frivolity, fête galante, to, within less than a century, the beginning of neoclassicism. I'm going to end there. I see I've gone over a few minutes. I apologize. And Kayla, if we have any questions or observations you can address, if not, maybe you have some comments as an art history student. So I'll let you take it away.
Yes, and I just want to thank you for this wonderful presentation. I will definitely keep an eye out on the chat. Feel free to either unmute yourself or type in the chat if anyone has any questions. I know I do, so maybe with this short amount of time left, I'll sneak one in. Just about how I was just wondering, because you mentioned how these Rococo works were placed like domestically in aristocratic homes, and I was just wondering, were the audience of Rococo works exclusively the aristocracy, or did members of like the general public or like any of the lower classes ever have access to these works?
That is such a great question. Excellent question. Good observation. Yes. Now, when you think about Chardin, he saw himself as a member of the middle class. And if you recall that painting of the fish and the cat, that is for a middle class home. Also, some of the portrait painters were, for example, even, well, I didn't show you, but some of these portrait painters didn't just do like Madame Pompadour and Marie Antoinette. They would do maybe the upper bourgeois. For example, L'Angelier, who actually is more Baroque, but kind of sneaks into the Rococo a little bit. He paints upper class people, but not the aristocracy. He paints working upper bourgeois. But yes, many of these artists, like even Coster, Valière Coster, she sometimes painted her own family. And some of these artists were not as interested in the aristocracy. So that's a great question. And yes, they did. They painted outside of just the aristocrats and the royal families. But you have to remember patronage. And often, you know, when Madame Pompadour decides she's going to sponsor you, or Marie Antoinette, your career is made. So that's where their sponsorship and patronage really was important to many of these artists. But great question, actually, very good question. I hope I answered it.
Yes, no, thank you. All righty. I'm not seeing many other questions. I mean, your talk was wonderful. I feel like we learned so much, covered all aspects of Rococo. So thank you so much for your talk once again. And thank you to everyone in our audience for joining us once again. We hope you can join us. We're actually having another talk tomorrow. It's going to be about the Golden Age in Spain. It'll be at 11 a.m. tomorrow.
So Kayla, thank you so much. And I look forward to giving other lectures and having my viewers come back. So thank you. And have a good rest of your day, everyone. And we'll see you soon. Thank you.
Bye.